This screencast is over the Scarlet Letter, chapters 16 through 18. Chapter 16 is called A Forest Walk, and as you think about this chapter, it's important that you be mindful of the symbolism of the forest. We talked about that earlier when we discussed Mistress Hibbins and her invitation to Hester to go into the forest to meet with the black man. Hester has decided it's time for her to speak to Dimmesdale. And of course, it would be impossible for her to speak to Dimmesdale in public. And it's important that she speak to him alone. This means she needs to find a time when he is not going to be around Chillingworth. There's a certain time that Hester knows that Dimmesdale is going to visit a sick member of their parish who lives somewhat away from Boston in some of the outskirt communities. And she knows that he will have to cross through the forest in order to get back to Boston. She knows when he will be there, and she knows that he will be alone. So she goes to meet him. As she and Pearl are waiting for the minister to make his appearance, it is clear that she plans to tell him the truth about Chillingworth's identity. As they are waiting, Pearl, again, an ever-intuitive child, comments that she knows that the black man haunts the forest. This, of course, somewhat surprises Hester because this is not something that she and Pearl have ever discussed before. Pearl said at one point she overheard a woman saying that the citizens of Boston go to the forest at night in order to meet the black man. This woman, of course, thought that Pearl was sleeping or taking a nap at the time that she was having this discussion, but Pearl was listening. This woman also asserted that over 2,000 people had written in his book, meaning the black man's book. This is something that was common in Puritan society, this idea that the devil had this book that he carried around and that people who had pledged their allegiance to him would have their name written in it. Pearl then, at that point, asks her mother if she had ever met the black man. Hester, again somewhat taken aback by her daughter's questions, tells her being Pearl, that yes, she has met the black man, and that the Scarlet Letter is the mark of that meeting with the black man. This is her second lie that she tells Pearl about the origin of her Scarlet Letter. Pearl then asks her mother if possibly that might be what's wrong with the Reverend Dimmesdale. Maybe he too has met the black man, and that is why he is constantly clutching at his heart. Before Hester gets a chance to really ponder her daughter's question, she hears and sees Dimmesdale coming through the forest. At that point, she sends Pearl off to play by herself so that she can speak to Dimmesdale alone. Chapter 17 is titled The Pastor and His Parishioner. The pastor in the chapter title is, of course, the Reverend Dimmesdale, and Hester is his parishioner, though she no longer formally is a parishioner because, as you know from previous chapters, Hester is not able to attend church. For the first time in years during this meeting, Hester and Dimmesdale are alone together, and they are free to talk openly about their lives. There's a long interlude during this chapter where the two of them talk about their lives these past 7 years, and they discuss the effects of their mutual sin. As a reader, you should be aware that during this time, it becomes very clear, and Hawthorne's point is very clear, in that because of her openness and inability to hide her sin, it seems that Hester dealt with this sin a long time ago, that it is no longer the focal point of her life. However, Dimmesdale, because he has never become open, never talked openly about his role in this sin has continued to haunt him. And that's definitely one of the messages Hawthorne is giving the reader as well, that Hester was forced to deal with it, so it no longer dominates her life. For Dimmesdale, it has been quite the opposite. At this point, he acknowledges that he knows he's a hypocrite. He knows that he spends his Sundays preaching to his parishioners about avoiding sin and about confessing your sin in the times that you do happen to sin, and he has done neither in his own life. He doesn't quite seem to realize as of yet that that is what is making him sick, that guilt and that cloud hanging over his head, but he's at least acknowledging the fact that he knows he's a hypocrite. At this point, Hester gives her warning about Chillingworth. And at first, Dimmesdale says, I believe the doctor's trying to help me. And then Hester lets him know that Chillingworth is my long-lost husband. At first, Dimmesdale, of course, is taken aback, and he is furious with her, just saying, how could you allow this man to have had so much contact with me? How could you allow him to be doing these types of things to me? But he quickly forgives her. He quickly understands and seems to realize that Hester would have been in a no-win situation. She could not have let him know who Chillingworth really was. And she, of course, had always hoped that Chillingworth would give up this vendetta and leave Dimmesdale alone. She knows now that is not going to happen. They both at this point express fear at what Chillingworth will do now that his true identity is known to the minister. They both seem very cognizant of what he is capable of. The two characters then discuss, what are our options now? What could we possibly do to get away from him, to get away from this community, to start new lives? They then discuss, really their only option is leaving Boston. And at that point, your only option really becomes returning to Europe. We've discussed that before. The other colonies are very far apart. Traveling there would be difficult, and tales of their former lives would no doubt follow them. Dimmesdale at this point, as you know my opinion of him, a kind of a weak character, says that he would never be able to do that. He could never start a new life on her own. Hester, at the end of this chapter, tells him that he does not have to be alone. That brings us to chapter 18, A Flood of Sunshine. Dimmesdale seems taken aback by this possibility that maybe they could all leave together. And by all, I mean Hester and Pearl and Dimmesdale. Maybe they could indeed start a new life together. They talk about going to the Spanish Main, which would be the Spanish mainland. They would refer to it as such to differentiate it from Portugal or other areas that Spain was in control of. Maybe they could actually be a happy family. This is where the idea of the flood of sunshine of the title comes in. They both, for the first time, seem to have this weight of sin lifted off of their shoulders as they start discussing this possibility of having a new life together. The mere suggestion of getting out from underneath this sin and the prying eyes of his Boston community, and especially getting out from under the influence of Chillingworth, seems to start bringing this minister back to life. They discuss that they would really like to leave this past behind them and stop punishing themselves for their sin. Of course, they've been punished in very different ways, but they have internally punished themselves. They're reminded of it all the time. And they seem to believe that if they could go away, start a new life, they could stop thinking about it all the time. They are both very excited by this prospect. And again, for the first time in the entire novel, Hester, as characterized in the book, throws off her scarlet letter A. She removes it to give illustration to the fact that this is how our lives could be. We could literally and figuratively get out from underneath this umbrella of adultery. Hester is especially excited at this point about Dimmesdale and Pearl getting to know each other. She calls Pearl back from playing in the forest and would like her to meet with Dimmesdale. Pearl, as she sees her mother, approaches them cautiously. She's never seen her mother with anyone else, really. And please remember that she also has always noted a connection between them.